There are killings the frontier tried to forget, and there are killings the frontier could never stop telling. This is one it could never stop telling. On a warm April evening in 1881, in a dusty two-story building at the western edge of a town, so violent that a sitting President of the United States had personally called its main road the most dangerous street in America. A shackled 21-year-old boy, condemned to hang, chained hand and foot, guarded day and night by two armed men, walked out a free man. Behind him, he left two lawmen dead in the dirt, one of them nearly cut in half by his own shotgun. It took less than a minute of actual violence. It has taken almost a century and a half to stop arguing about it. The boy's name was Henry McCarty. The world would remember him as Billy the Kid, and the escape he pulled off that afternoon, brazen, bloody, and executed with a calm that chilled everyone who witnessed it, would become the single most audacious jailbreak in the history of the American West. Not the most technically clever, not the one with the longest tunnel or the cleverest disguise, but the most brutal, the most personal, the most unforgettable. Because Billy the Kid didn't dig his way to freedom in the dark. He didn't slip away quietly while the guards slept. He walked down a staircase in broad daylight, turned around, and killed the men standing between him and the horizon. And then he took his time about leaving. But to understand why this escape burned itself so deeply into American memory, you have to understand the men who died that day. You have to understand the war that put Billy in those chains. And you have to understand that one of the two men he killed had spent weeks doing everything in his power to make the boy's final days a living hell. Because this wasn't just a prison break. It was a reckoning. And by the time the smoke cleared over Lincoln, New Mexico, the line between justice and vengeance had been erased entirely. So who was really the villain in that courthouse? The condemned killer in the leg irons? Or the lawman with the badge and the shotgun who had promised, with a smile, to watch him swing? Let's ride back to a place and a time where the law and the outlaw were often the same men, wearing different hats, and where the story of the most brutal prison break in Old West history begins. To understand the courthouse, you first have to understand the war. Because Billy the Kid did not arrive in that Lincoln jail as a random thief or a nameless drifter. He arrived as the last living symbol of a conflict that had torn an entire county apart, a conflict so vicious it drew in cattle barons, corrupt politicians, hired guns, and a territorial governor who would later become one of the most famous novelists in American history. Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, in the late 1870s, was not a place governed by law in any way a modern person would recognize. It was governed by power, and the men who held that power, a merchant political machine known locally as the House, run by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, controlled nearly everything. They controlled the store where ranchers bought supplies. They controlled the contracts to feed the nearby army fort. They controlled the courts, the sheriff, and the flow of money. To cross the House was to invite ruin, and often death. Into this powder keg rode a young Englishman named John Tunstall, an ambitious rancher who, along with his lawyer Alexander McSween and the powerful cattleman John Chisholm, decided to challenge the House's monopoly. And into Tunstall's employ came a slight, quick-smiling, buck-toothed teenager who was already handy with a gun, and already, at barely 18, no stranger to violence. That teenager was Billy the Kid. On February 18, 1878, everything detonated. A posse tied to the Murphy-Dolan faction ran John Tunstall down on a lonely road south of Lincoln and shot him dead. To the young men who had worked for him, who had, in some measure, loved him, it was murder, plain and simple. The next day they had themselves sworn in as deputies and gave themselves a name that would echo through Western history, the Regulators. They vowed to hunt down every man responsible for Tunstall's death. And Billy the Kid rode at the heart of them. Asterisk, what followed was not a series of arrests. It was a war. The regulators captured men they blamed and killed them on the trail. The territorial governor responded by stripping away their legal authority and branding them outlaws overnight. The violence escalated until it culminated in a 5-day battle in the streets of Lincoln itself in July 1878. A running gunfight that ended with the McSween house in flames and men shooting each other down as they fled the fire. In that inferno, Billy the Kid killed a man named Bob Beckwith. Remember that name, because Beckwith had a close friend, a fellow Murphy Dolan gunman who would never, ever forgive the Kid for that killing. His name was Bob Ollinger, and years later, fate would place Bob Ollinger in a courthouse with a shotgun and a helpless, shackled Billy the Kid at his mercy. Think about what that meant for the boy at the center of it. Billy the Kid was not, by the standards of his own time, an old or hardened criminal when the war swallowed him. He was a teenager who had already lost his mother to tuberculosis, who had been orphaned young, who had drifted across the territories, doing whatever work he could find and getting into whatever trouble found him. He was slight, almost delicate in build, with prominent front teeth and a ready grin that made people underestimate him, right up until the moment he proved deadly. He spoke fluent Spanish, danced well, charmed easily, and was, by the accounts of those who knew him, genuinely well-liked in the Hispanic villages of the territory. This was not the snarling monster of the dime novels. This was a personable young man who happened to be caught in a war that turned him into a killer. And that contradiction, the charming boy and the lethal gunman living in the same body, is precisely what would make his legend impossible to pin down. The war eventually burned itself out, but it left Billy the Kid an outlaw with a price on his head and a reputation that was spreading like wildfire. Newspapers as far away as New York City were printing lurid stories about the boy bandit of New Mexico, transforming a local range war combatant into a national sensation. Each retelling made him more dangerous, more prolific, more mythic. By the time the ink dried on the East Coast, Billy the Kid was being credited with killing a man for every year of his young life. A wild exaggeration, but one that suited the appetite of a public hungry for tales of the untamed frontier. And a tall, lean former buffalo hunter named Pat Garrett, a man who had once, by some accounts, drunk and gambled alongside the Kid, a man who knew his habits and his hiding places and the way his mind worked, got himself elected sheriff of Lincoln County with one clear mandate: bring Billy the Kid in, dead or alive. It was the pairing of a lifetime. The hunter and the hunted who had once, perhaps, been something like friends. And it would end, inevitably, with one of them dead. Garrett was relentless. In December 1880, he trapped the Kid and his companions at a place called Stinking Springs, and after a cold, tense standoff, Billy surrendered. He was taken first to Santa Fe, then south to the town of Mesilla to stand trial. And it was on that journey, and in the weeks that followed, that a personal cruelty entered the story, a cruelty that would make Billy's eventual revenge feel, to many who told the tale afterward, almost like justice. The trial itself was swift, and its outcome was never really in doubt. On April 13th, 1881, in Mesilla, a judge named Warren Bristol sentenced Billy the Kid to hang by the neck until dead for the murder of Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady, a killing from back in the war years. The execution was set for May 13th. Billy had exactly 1 month to live. He was loaded into a wagon and hauled back north to Lincoln, chained to the floorboards for the entire 5-day journey, to be held in the very building that had once been the headquarters of the house, the Murphy Dolan store, now converted into the Lincoln County Courthouse and Jail. There, on the second floor, in a corner room that had ironically once been the private bedroom of Billy's old enemy Lawrence Murphy. The kid was chained hand and foot and placed under round-the-clock guard. And here is where the story sharpens into something crueler than a simple countdown to the gallows. Because of the two deputies assigned to guard him, one was a decent man doing an unpleasant job, and the other was Bob Ollinger. You need to understand Bob Ollinger to understand why this escape became a legend rather than a footnote. Ollinger was not a good man wearing a badge. By nearly every account that survives, he was a bully, a brawler, and quite possibly a stone-cold killer who happened to have the law on his side. Born in Indiana around 1850, he had drifted west like so many others and had taken to the frontier's violence with an unsettling enthusiasm. He rode with a gang of rustlers known as the Seven Rivers Warriors before pinning on a badge, and even after he became a lawman, the line between his official duties and his personal bloodlust remained disturbingly thin. He had ridden with the Murphy-Dolan faction during the Lincoln County War, the same faction that murdered John Tunstall and set the whole tragedy in motion. He was, in other words, on the opposite side of the very war that had made Billy the Kid an outlaw. Their hatred was not a jailhouse invention. It was years in the making, forged in gunsmoke. He had killed men in gambling disputes, shooting a supposed friend in the throat over a card game. By one account, he had once been charged with shooting an unarmed man in the back while supposedly helping to make an arrest, though the charge was quietly dismissed. Physically, he was imposing, big, broad, nicknamed Pecos Bob, and by some, the Big Indian, the kind of man who used his size to intimidate and who enjoyed doing it. One chilling line that has come down through history claims that even Ollinger's own mother said her son was a murderer from the cradle. Sheriff Pat Garrett himself, who reluctantly kept Ollinger on as a deputy despite a clear personal distaste for the man, is said to have once physically intervened to stop Ollinger from gunning down an unarmed suspect in cold blood. This was the man now holding the keys to Billy the Kid's cell. This was the man the territory had entrusted with guarding a helpless, shackled boy in the final weeks before his execution. And Bob Ollinger, given absolute power over an enemy he despised, did exactly what his nature demanded. He made the boy suffer, and Ollinger did not guard Billy. He tormented him. Day after day, he taunted the shackled boy about the rope that was waiting for him. He reminded him, again and again, that he was going to hang. He had bought himself a brand-new weapon, specifically for the occasion of guarding the kid, a 10-gauge double-barreled Whitney shotgun, a fearsome piece of hardware that Ollinger reportedly nicknamed, and that legend would later christen, the Widowmaker. He would pace outside Billy's reach with that gun, sometimes jabbing at the prisoner with the muzzle, bragging about what it would do to whoever caught its low dot. There is a moment, recorded in multiple accounts, that captures the whole poisonous relationship between these two men, and that reads, in hindsight, like something out of a tragedy written by a playwright who already knew the ending. One day, in front of the kid, Ollinger deliberately loaded both barrels of that shotgun, packing each with a heavy charge of buckshot. He turned to Billy and said, menacingly, that the man who got one of those loads would feel it dot, and Billy the Kid, chained to the floor, condemned to die, utterly at this man's mercy, looked back at him and replied, calm as still water, I expect he will. But be careful, Bob, or you might shoot yourself accidentally. Neither man could have known how those words would echo. But Billy, it seems, was already thinking, already watching, already waiting for the one crack of daylight he needed. Because Sheriff Pat Garrett, the one man who truly understood how dangerous the kid was, had made a critical mistake. He'd left town April 28, 1881, late afternoon. Sheriff Garrett was miles away in the mining town of White Oaks, collecting taxes, and tradition insists buying the lumber that would be used to build the gallows to hang Billy the Kid. He had left explicit instructions with his 2 deputies. Watch the kid like a hawk. Garrett knew Billy. He knew that the boy's cheerful, joking demeanor wasn't resignation. It was confidence. Somewhere behind that easy smile, Billy the Kid fully believed he was going to escape. And Garrett, who knew him better than almost anyone, was afraid he might be right out around 5 o'clock in the evening. Bob Ollinger did the thing that would cost him his life. He walked 5 of the other prisoners being held in the courthouse across the dusty street to the Wortley Hotel for their supper. Billy was considered far too dangerous to be taken anywhere. His meals were brought to him. So when Ollinger crossed that street, he left the kid behind under the sole guard of the other deputy, a man named James Bell. Bell was, by the surviving accounts, a fundamentally different kind of lawman than Ollinger. He seems to have treated Billy with something approaching basic human decency. The 2 of them had reportedly even played cards together to pass the long hours. Whatever resentment Bell may have privately carried, he had ridden with a posse against the kid and had lost a friend named James Carlyle in a shootout blamed on Billy's gang. He kept it in check. He was doing his duty, and he was doing it without cruelty, which is part of what makes what happened next so tragic. Because when Billy the Kid finally made his move, it was gentle James Bell, not the sadistic Bob Ollinger, who died first. Here is where the historical record fractures into legend, and where one of the great mysteries of the Old West lives to this day. How did Billy the Kid, shackled and unarmed, get his hands on a gun? The most enduring version of the story goes like this. Billy asked Bell to take him downstairs and out back to the privy, the outhouse behind the courthouse. It was a routine request, one that had surely been granted before. Bell agreed. The 2 of them made their way down the stairs and out to the yard, Billy shuffling in his chains, Bell following close behind. And waiting there, hidden, so the legend says, was a loaded pistol. Tradition in Lincoln holds that a young admirer of Billy's, a boy connected to a local family sympathetic to the kid, had smuggled the weapon into the outhouse, wrapped in a newspaper, and hidden it where Billy could find it. Some accounts add an even more cinematic detail, that Billy's loyal friend Sam Corbett, who visited him every day, had slipped him a scrap of paper bearing a single word, privy, so the kid would know exactly where to look. There is a competing theory, and it deserves mention because it changes the moral color of the whole event. Some accounts hold that there was no hidden pistol at all, that Billy, ahead of Bell on the stairs, simply slipped his notoriously small hands free of the handcuffs, whirled, and beat the deputy with the loose iron, then wrestled Bell's own revolver away from him in the struggle before shooting him with it. In this version, Billy improvised his entire escape in a matter of seconds with nothing but his own quickness and nerve. In the other version, the smuggled gun version, the escape was planned in advance by a network of loyal friends who never stopped believing in him. Which is true? We will almost certainly never know. And that uncertainty is the first of many that cling to this story like desert dust. What is certain is this. Somewhere between that outhouse and the top of the courthouse stairs, Billy the Kid armed himself. And then the killing began. From that point forward, every account, smuggled pistol or wrestled revolver, agrees on the terrible sequence of what happened next. As they climbed back up the staircase, Billy moved ahead of Bell, and at the top, at a blind corner where the deputy couldn't see him, the kid made his move. In one account, he slipped his slender hands free of the cuffs and beat Bell with the loose iron. In another, he simply spun around with the smuggled pistol already in his fist. What happened next was fast and merciless. Bell, realizing in an instant that everything had gone catastrophically wrong, turned and ran back down the stairs. Billy told him to stop. Bell kept running, and Billy the Kid shot him. The bullet caught Bell as he fled, by some accounts passing clean through his body, striking the wall at the bottom of the stairwell and leaving a hole that visitors to the Lincoln Courthouse can still be shown to this day. Mortally wounded, blood pouring from him, Bell staggered out the door and into the arms of a man named Godfrey Gauss, a former ranch cook who had been working in the garden behind the building. Bell collapsed and died almost instantly. Gauss, stunned, lowered the dead deputy to the ground. And then he did the only thing he could think to do. He ran to raise the alarm. But inside the courthouse, Billy the Kid was already moving with a cold, terrifying purpose. Still hobbled by the leg irons around his ankles, he made his way to Sheriff Garrett's office, which doubled as the building's armory. And there, leaning against the wall, was the one weapon in all the world that Billy the Kid must have most wanted in his hands at that moment. Bob Ollinger's shotgun. The Widowmaker. The very gun the deputy had waved under his nose. The gun Ollinger had loaded in front of him, while promising that whoever caught its load would feel that Doc Billy took it. And then he limped to the window at the east end of the second floor, the window that looked down over the side yard and across the street toward the Wortley Hotel, and he waited. He knew exactly what was coming. He had heard the shot that killed Bell echo across the whole town, and he knew that Bob Ollinger, hearing that same shot, would come running. Across the street, Bob Ollinger had indeed heard the gunfire, and here the cruel machinery of fate clicked into its final position. Because when Ollinger heard shots ring out from the courthouse, where Billy the Kid was being held, he made exactly the wrong assumption. He assumed that Bell had been forced to shoot the kid. He assumed his prisoner was the one lying dead. And so, rather than approaching with caution, Bob Ollinger came hurrying out of the hotel and across the street toward the building. Some accounts say calling out to ask whether Bell had killed the kid. Godfrey Gauss, standing in the yard beside the body of the deputy who had just died in his arms, saw Ollinger coming, and Gauss called out the truth that would seal the deputy's fate. The kid has killed Bell. Ollinger froze. And in that instant of dawning horror, a voice came down from the second-story window above him, a cheerful, almost friendly voice. It was Billy the Kid, looking down the twin barrels of Ollinger's own shotgun at the man who had tormented him for weeks. "Hello, Bob." Bob Ollinger looked up. He saw the boy he had bullied. He saw his own Widowmaker pointed down at him. And in the last moment of his life, he is said to have understood everything. He turned to Gauss and said quietly, "Yes, and he's killed me too." Billy pulled both triggers. The blast tore into Ollinger at close range, both barrels at once, cutting him down instantly. He was dead before he hit the ground, killed by the very weapon he had bought specifically to guard the kid, loaded with the very charge he had promised would make its victim feel it. There is a legend, impossible now to fully verify, that Ollinger had packed those shells with silver dimes as an extra cruelty. Whether that detail is true or a flourish added by later storytellers, the essential facts are grim enough on their own. The bully with the badge had been killed by his own gun, in front of witnesses, by the shackled boy he had spent weeks tormenting, and then Billy the Kid did something that turned an escape into a legend. He didn't run. Most men, having just killed 2 lawmen, would have fled in blind panic. Billy the Kid took his time. According to the accounts that survive, he broke the shotgun, snapping it, some say, over the porch railing and hurled the pieces down at Ollinger's body, adding a final gesture of contempt to the killing. Then he turned his attention to the iron shackles, still locked around his own legs. He called down to Godfrey Gauss to bring him a horse and to throw up a small prospector's, pick a miner's tool, so he could work at his chains. And for the better part of an hour, in full view of a growing crowd of townspeople, Billy the Kid sat and labored at his leg irons. He managed to free only one leg, looping the loose chain up over his belt so he could move. He gathered weapons from the armory. He was in no visible hurry at all, and this is the detail that has always astonished those who study the escape. Nobody stopped him. The 5 other prisoners had gathered. Many of Lincoln's respectable citizens had gathered. They stood and they watched a condemned double murderer arm himself, free himself, and prepare to ride away, and not one of them lifted a hand to interfere. Some of that was surely terror, but some of it, historians have long suspected, was something closer to complicity. Bob Ollinger had made a great many enemies in Lincoln. There were people in that crowd who were not sorry to see him dead. Legend even claims, and legend is all it can be, that before he rode off, Billy the Kid shook hands with some of the townsfolk, and that he finally rode out of Lincoln slowly, at a walk, whistling a lively tune, as though he had all the time in the world. By the time he pointed his stolen horse toward the horizon and disappeared, Bell and Ollinger had been lying dead for over an hour. 2 lawmen killed, a condemned manished, and a legend detonated across the entire country when Pat Garrett returned to Lincoln and learned what had happened in his absence. He was, by all accounts, devastated and furious in equal measure. In distant Santa Fe, Territorial Governor Lew Wallace, the same Lew Wallace who was at that very time finishing the manuscript of a novel called Ben-Hur, received a 1-line telegram informing him of the escape. Wallace posted a $500 reward for the Kid's recapture. And then, remarkably, he left New Mexico entirely, appointed to a diplomatic post overseas, exiting the story of Billy the Kid just as it reached its bloodiest turn. The escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse was, in the most literal sense, the high point of Billy the Kid's brief life, the moment his legend became truly unkillable. But it was also, tragically, the beginning of the end, because a boy who has just shot his way out of a hanging, killing 2 deputies in the process, has burned every bridge behind him. There would be no more deals, no more pardons, no more mercy. Pat Garrett would not rest until the Kid was dead. And here the story circles back to a promise that had been broken years before, a promise that would haunt the legend for the next 70 years and beyond. Because back in 1879, in the middle of the Lincoln County War, Governor Lew Wallace had reportedly offered Billy the Kid a deal: testify about the killings you witnessed, and receive a pardon in exchange. Billy, according to the accounts, held up his end. He testified, but the pardon never came. The promise evaporated, buried under politics and the inconvenient reality of a boy who had killed too many men. That broken promise would become the emotional core of the entire Billy the Kid legend, and, decades later, the beating heart of one of the strangest afterlives any outlaw ever had. For now, though, Billy was free and running out of places to run. For roughly 2.5 months after the courthouse escape, he drifted through the country he knew best. The sun-baked land around Fort Sumner, hiding at sheep camps, borrowing horses, relying on the loyalty of the Hispanic communities who had always sheltered him and fed him and hidden him from the law. These were people who genuinely loved Billy the Kid, who saw in him not a monster, but a young man who had stood against the powerful men of the house, who danced at their fandangos and spoke their language and treated them with a respect the Anglo power structure rarely did. Among them, Billy was safe in a way he could never be anywhere else. But safety and freedom are not the same thing. Here is the great, agonizing question at the center of Billy the Kid's final weeks. The question that has kept historians arguing for over a century. Why didn't he run? He had just escaped a hanging in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The whole territory knew Pat Garrett would come for him with everything he had. Mexico was close. The border meant safety, anonymity, a chance to disappear and start again. Any rational fugitive would have crossed it without looking back. And Billy the Kid, who was nothing if not intelligent, who had proven again and again that he could think and move faster than the men hunting him, chose to stay. He lingered in the one region where everyone knew his face, where a single informant could seal his doom. Why? Some say he was in love, that a young woman near Fort Sumner held him there against all reason. Some say he simply could not bear to leave the only home and the only people he had ever truly known. Some say he was tired, and that a part of him had stopped running long before Garrett's bullet found him. And some, of course, the believers, the ones who took Brushy Bill's word, say that he did leave, that the man who lingered and died was someone else entirely, and that the real kid was already gone. Whatever the truth, the official story says he stayed, and staying killed him. On the night of July 14, 1881, acting on a tip that the kid was hiding near Fort Sumner, Pat Garrett rode through the darkness with two companions. He slipped into the bedroom of a man named Pete Maxwell to ask about Billy's whereabouts. And into that same dark room, by pure catastrophic chance, walked Billy the Kid, sensing a stranger in the shadows, asking in Spanish, "Guyanese? Guyanese? Who is it? Who is it?" Garrett recognized the voice. He fired twice. And Billy the Kid, the boy who had shot his way out of a hanging just 11 weeks earlier, fell dead on the floor. He was, by the best reckoning, 21 years old, the most brutal prison break in Old West history had bought Billy the Kid exactly 77 days of freedom. And then it was over. Or was it? Here is where the story of the Lincoln Courthouse escape becomes something far stranger than a simple tale of blood and daring. Because the very audacity of that escape, the sheer impossibility of it, a shackled boy killing 2 armed guards and riding calmly out of town, planted a seed of doubt that would flower into one of the most enduring mysteries in American folklore. If Billy the Kid could cheat the hangman's rope in April, some would come to whisper, then who's to say he couldn't cheat Pat Garrett's bullet in July? The killing at Fort Sumner had been done in near total darkness. There was no formal modern inquest of the kind we would demand today. The body was buried quickly, and within a few short years, rumors began to circulate, quiet at first, then louder, that the man Pat Garrett shot that night was not Billy the Kid at all. That Garrett, eager for the reward and the fame, had killed another man and passed the body off as the Kid's. That Billy the Kid, the boy who had escaped the inescapable in Lincoln, had escaped one final time. Into the shadows of history. For nearly 70 years, these were just rumors. And then, in the late 1940s, an old man in Texas stepped forward and claimed the rumors were true. He said his name was Brushy Bill Roberts. And he said that he was Billy the Kid. The claim electrified and divided the country. This wasn't some obvious fraud stumbling over his story. Brushy Bill knew things, intimate details of the Lincoln County War, the names of minor figures, the layout of the courthouse, the specifics of the escape itself. He bore old scars. He could reportedly still slip his hands free of a pair of handcuffs, just as the Kid was famous for doing. And most poignantly of all, he wanted just one thing before he died, not fame, not money, but the pardon he insisted Governor Lew Wallace had promised him back in 1879 and never delivered. That same broken promise, reaching across 7 decades to demand, at last, to be honored. Consider for a moment how strange and specific his knowledge was. Brushy Bill didn't just claim to be Billy the Kid in vague, general terms. He described the Lincoln County War with the intimacy of a man who had bled in it. He named allies and enemies who had long since faded from public memory. He recounted the escape from the courthouse, the very escape we have just walked through, with details that lined up unnervingly with the historical record. He talked about the broken pardon. He talked about slipping away into Mexico and living for decades under a rotation of assumed names. Investigators who examined him reportedly counted more than 24 old scars on his body, wounds consistent with the violent life the kid was known to have lived. And he could still, as an old man, work his hands free of a pair of handcuffs, the same trick that may have saved his life on that courthouse staircase in 1881. Was it all an elaborate performance by a gifted old storyteller who had absorbed the legend so completely that he came to believe it? Or was it, impossibly, the truth? The establishment had no patience for the question. When Brushy Bill was finally brought before New Mexico's governor in 1950 to plead his case and beg for the pardon he insisted he was owed, the moment collapsed into humiliation. The aging, frail man, reportedly weakened by strokes, overwhelmed, bombarded by hostile and skeptical questions before a crowd, faltered badly. He couldn't perform on command. He couldn't produce the polished, courtroom-ready testimony the officials demanded. And so they wrote him off as a fraud and sent him away. Days later, walking down a street in the small town of Hico, Texas, the old man collapsed and died of a heart attack. He never got his pardon. He carried his secret, whatever it truly was, into the grave with him. But death did not silence Brushy Bill Roberts. If anything, it amplified him. His claim, dismissed in a single afternoon by a governor's office, refused to stay buried. In the decades that followed, a strange and growing movement of researchers, journalists, and amateur historians took up his cause. His story became the subject of books that argued fiercely on both sides. It was dramatized on national television, most famously on the program Unsolved Mysteries, which introduced the theory to millions of Americans who had never questioned the official ending. Hollywood embraced it too. The film Young Guns 2 framed its entire narrative around an elderly man claiming to be the kid, giving Brushy Bill's improbable story a cinematic afterlife. And then science entered the fray. In the 1990s, researchers using advanced facial comparison techniques compared the one authenticated photograph of Billy, the kid, against images of a young Brushy Bill, and reported a startlingly high match, enough to make even skeptics pause. In the early 2000s, the controversy reached its most dramatic peak. A coalition of New Mexico lawmen and historians proposed the unthinkable: exhume the graves, dig up the body buried as Billy the Kid at Fort Sumner, dig up the remains of the kid's mother, extract DNA, and compare it, finally, scientifically, definitively, against Brushy Bill Roberts. The truth, they argued, was lying underground, waiting to be read. But the graves would not cooperate. Decades of floods had washed over the Fort Sumner cemetery, scattering markers and erasing the precise location of the kid's supposed body. Legal challenges piled up. Families protested. And in 2004, the courts shut the whole effort down. No bodies would be exhumed. No DNA would be tested. The question would remain exactly what it had always been: open, unresolved, eternal. To this day, in a Texas cemetery, a headstone reads, William H. Roberts, Billy the Kid, and people still come to stand before it and wonder whether the most brutal prison break in Old West history was, in the end, only the first of the kid's two great escapes, and it all traces back to that courthouse in Lincoln. Because if Billy the Kid had died on the gallows in May of 1881, meekly and on schedule, there would be no legend to argue over. There would be no mystery. It was the escape, the brutal, impossible, unforgettable escape that made him immortal. It was the sight of a shackled boy killing two lawmen and whistling his way out of town that convinced generations of Americans that this was a man who simply could not be caught, could not be held, could not be killed. A man who might, just might, have slipped away one final time. So what do we make of it? all these years later? What do we make of the most brutal prison break in Old West history? We could call it a tragedy. 2 men died that afternoon. One of them, James Bell, apparently a decent lawman who had shown the kid kindness and was rewarded with a bullet in the back as he ran for his life. His death is the part of the story that gets lost beneath the mythology, and it shouldn't. Whatever Bob Ollinger deserved, Bell deserved better. We could call it justice, of a rough and terrible frontier kind. Bob Ollinger was, by nearly every honest account, a cruel man who abused his badge and tormented a helpless prisoner for the pleasure of it, and he died by his own weapon, in a manner so perfectly ironic that it hardly seems real. There is a reason that Hollywood has returned again and again to the image of the sneering bully getting both barrels of his own shotgun. It feels to something deep in us like the universe balancing a scale, or we could call it what it truly was, the moment a doomed boy refused to accept the ending that had been written for him, and in refusing, wrote himself into legend forever. Billy the Kid was no hero. He was a killer, linked to the deaths of at least half a dozen men, possibly more. But he was also a symbol of defiance, of the refusal to submit, of the wild and lawless freedom that the American West both celebrated and feared. And in that courthouse in Lincoln, chained and condemned, and utterly without hope, he became that symbol completely. There is something worth sitting within the way this escape has been remembered, the way it has been sanded and polished by 140 years of retelling until the ugly edges almost disappear. We remember the "Hello, Bob." We remember the bully getting both barrels of his own gun. We remember the whistling ride out of town, the handshakes, the impossible cool of a boy who had all the time in the world. It plays like a scene from a movie, and indeed it has played as a scene in dozens of movies. But strip away the mythology for a moment and look at what actually happened in that building. 2 men were shot to death within the span of a few minutes. One of them was almost certainly a decent human being who had shown the shooter kindness. The other, however cruel, was engaged to be married, was somebody's son, somebody's friend, a human being with a life that ended in a spray of buckshot on a dusty street. The frontier had a way of turning slaughter into folklore, and we should never entirely lose sight of the blood beneath the legend. And yet the legend endures for a reason, and the reason is not simply that we are drawn to violence. It endures because it speaks to something the American imagination has never been able to let go of, the fantasy of the man who cannot be caged. Billy the Kid, in that courthouse, embodied the purest version of a myth this country has told itself since its founding, that no wall is high enough, no chain strong enough, no authority absolute enough to hold a truly free spirit against its will. It is a dangerous myth, and a beautiful one, and it lives in that second-story window in Lincoln, as surely as it lives anywhere on earth, that the building still stands today. You can walk up those same stairs. You can stand at the same east-facing window where a 21-year-old boy waited with a shotgun and said, "Hello, Bob." You can see the hole in the wall where a bullet is said to have passed through a fleeing man's body. The plaques on the ground still mark the spots where Bell and Ollinger fell, and the questions still hang in that dry desert air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Was Billy the Kid a monster or a victim of his times? Did Pat Garrett really kill him in that dark bedroom, or did the boy who escaped the inescapable escape one final time? And in that courthouse, on that April afternoon, was the real villain the killer in the chains, or the lawman with the badge and the widowmaker? The frontier never gave us clean answers. It gave us a shackled boy, 2 dead men, an hour of impossible calm, and a legend that refuses to die. Maybe that's the most honest thing the Old West ever left us, the understanding that sometimes the line between the outlaw and the lawman, between justice and vengeance, between the hunter and the hunted, was never really a line at all. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe Billy the Kid got what was coming to him in that dark room at Fort Sumner, or do you think the boy who escaped the Lincoln County Courthouse cheated death one final time and lived out his days under another name? Was Bob Ollinger a lawman who died in the line of duty, or a bully who finally reaped what he'd sown? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. And tell me, what city and country are you watching from? Drop your flag below and say hello. We love seeing just how far these stories from the dusty streets of the Old West manage to travel. If you made it this far, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden legends, forgotten killers, and unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. Because the West is full of ghosts, and we're just getting started.